Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to an ITIF event examining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And I'm Rob Atkinson, president of ITIF, and I'm co-author of a report we're releasing today with my colleague Stephen Ezell, who couldn't be here. He's in Berlin today on some other work. So what we're going to do is I'm going to briefly present the overview of our paper and our arguments about the TPP, and then we're going to have a great panel of probably three, leaving aside people who are currently in government, three of the leading trade experts in Washington, and I'm going to start by quickly introducing them. Grant Aldonis, who's immediately on my left, is the principal managing director of Split Rock International, a DC-based trade and investment consulting firm. Grant holds the William H. Scholl Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also an adjunct professor of law and a member of the board of directors of the Institute for International Economic Law at Georgetown University's Law Center. He began his career as a Foreign Service Officer in 1980, was a trade negotiator at USTR before entering private practice. He served for over a decade at Miller and Chevalier doing international trade work, and then in the late 90s he became the Chief International Trade Counsel to Senate Finance. Then in 2001, Grant was asked by President Bush to serve as the Undersecretary for International Trade at the Department of Commerce. He's also on the board of directors of OPIC and the executive director of the, he has served as the executive director of the President's Export Council. The unfortunate thing, by the way, about this panel is it's three lawyers and one economist, so I don't know what that means, but Grant is a lawyer, has a JD from the University of Minnesota. Brian Pomper is a partner at Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. Brian has more than a decade of experience in government and the private sector on trade issues. He's a founding partner of Harbin Pomper Strategies. Prior to that, he was the Chief International Trade Counsel on the Democratic staff for the Senate Finance Committee for Max Baucus, and was involved in virtually every major international economic issue during his 4 years on the committee staff. He also serves as an adjunct professor teaching international trade policy at George Washington's Graduate School of Political Management, and Brian earned his law degree from Cornell University. And finally, on the far left, Karan Badier is the Vice President and Senior Counsel for International Law and Policy for General Electric. In that role, he oversees GE's engagement on public policy issues with governments around the world. He, before joining GE, Karan was the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, with a presidential rank, appointment of the rank of ambassador, and he oversaw U.S. trade policy with respect to Asia and Africa. His achievements included negotiating the successful U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the U.S.-Vietnam Bilateral WTO Accession Agreement, the U.S.-India Trade Policy Forum, and many others. Before joining USTR, he was Assistant Secretary for Aviation and International Affairs at DOT. He has written and spoken extensively on trade policy. He's also taught at Georgetown University Law Center as a member of the boards of the National Foreign Trade Council, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and many other groups. And Karan has a law degree from Columbia. Okay.
That's it. We can leave it, right?
So while I wait for the slides to pop up here, there we go, and now that's the wrong slide.
Okay. See that? Yeah.
So now I'm halfway through my presentation, and this is one of the most efficient presentations I've ever given. Are we going back? Okay. So let me start by arguing that as we argued, my colleague Stephen Ezell in a report in November or October of last year called The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and the Self-Destructive of Global Innovation Policy. We argue that this problem of innovation mercantilism is widespread and growing. And what we mean by innovation mercantilism is the practice in countries of using a set of illegitimate and unfair policies to spur innovation and the expansion of high value added production, particularly exports. We see this recently just in the ITC report that was released last week, where the ITC examined the issue of indigenous innovation in China, as well as IP theft by Chinese governments and Chinese enterprises and individuals. And what the ITC found was that that IP theft costs American businesses $48.2 billion a year. And if they had stopped this, we would have $107 billion more of exports, and we would create 2.1 million jobs. Now, if you remember that for every export, we create another two jobs. We're talking about 6 million jobs in the U.S. economy just from stopping China's IP theft. So this is a huge, huge issue, and it's one that we have to come to grips with. So we really have only, I would argue, 3 possible responses to this problem. The kind of dominant response, I think, that has become part of the Washington thinking on trade is, we really don't need to do anything. Economists, a lot of economists will talk about that it's really okay if you have one-sided markets here. As long as we're open, that's okay. It doesn't matter if they're closed. It doesn't matter if they're mercantilist. As one leading member of Congress said to me at a dinner once, he said, Adam Smith proved that mercantilists only hurt themselves. Well, I would argue they do hurt themselves, but it's a sort of mutually assured destruction. It's like a suicide pact. They hurt themselves, but they also hurt us and probably hurt us more. So the second response you hear from this is, look, mercantilism is rife. There's nothing we can do about it. We just need to become mercantilists ourselves. And this is, Ian Fletcher, for example, just had a book on arguing this point that we really can't do anything about it. So let's just become mercantilists. Let's close our borders. Let's have Buy America provisions. Let's do all the things that these other countries are doing. Now that would be a huge mistake in our view. It would essentially turn our backs on 50 or 60 years of trade liberalization. So we shouldn't switch, we should fight. How many are old enough to remember those great Terraton ads from the 70s? This is the good old days when you could advertise smoking with impunity. What we really need to do, we would argue, is systemically challenge mercantilist and mercantilist practices, while at the same time crafting stronger alliances with free traders. So what we really need to be doing is finding other countries whose dominant logic is not mercantilism, but is free trade, like ours, and work more closely with them. The problem is that the WTO, which in theory is supposed to be that forum, we would argue has not been that forum. Initially, when the WTO was created, it was really a body of the free traders. It was principally Europe, the Commonwealth countries, and America. And all of those countries have this set of principles that currency prices should be set by markets, IP and property are the property of the owners, investment decisions are made by businesses. And what's happened over the years is the WTO has become larger, it's become populated by essentially mercantilist countries who really don't want the WTO to be full-throated advocates for fighting mercantilism. So we have this new opportunity here. And that's the TPP. So the TPP is essentially a trade agreement that's in place now, and what's on the table is a significant expansion of it, with the U.S. potentially joining it. And you can see the countries there that if this next round of expansion goes through, it would be a trade agreement with Australia, Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and the U.S. So this is a big deal. This would be a significant amount of our exports already go to these countries, and a significant opportunity for us to expand integration with a set of important players. But if we want to do the TPP right, we would argue we've got to fix some systemic problems that these countries already have. So we have an opportunity to use the TPP as a new approach, a new stake in the ground, if you will, of saying you know what, we're going to approach trade in a new way. These agreements are only going to be for the people who generally play by the rules. And by the way, I know whenever I say this, people always bring up, you know, well, aren't you guys subsidizing and protecting sugar? Yes, we are, and it's a tragedy, and we shouldn't do it. I get that. But by and large, our mercantilist practices are the exception rather than the rule. By and large, countries like Canada, like the United States, like the Great Britain, are not mercantilist in philosophy. We're mercantilist because we have distortions in our political process that allow a few mercantilist practices to take place. Some of these countries are systemic mercantilists. They view their entire economic strategy and their entire economic philosophy around boosting exports largely through mercantilist practices. So what we need to do if we want to get a gold standard TPP, we've got to have an agreement that does several things. First of all, sorry about that. That's really interesting. We've got to have something that's quite slow and gradual.
Sort of like the TPP.
Exactly. The TPP. Let me start with the first one. And perhaps this is the most important one. We have to have an agreement that protects intellectual property rights in a significant way. And the core reason for that is there's no other country whose economic base and whose export base is more dependent upon intellectual property than the United States. Whether that's in things like movies or digital IP or embedded in analog products like jet airplanes or GE turbines or pharmaceutical drugs. Yet when you look at the TPP nations, they have spotty records on IP enforcement at best. Under the USTR 2011 Special 301 report, 4 of the countries, Brunei, Malaysia, Peru, and Vietnam, are on the Special 301 watch list for IP theft. Chile's on the priority watch list. Just to give you an example, USTR placed Vietnam on its watch list because of, quote, high levels of copyright piracy, increasing levels of piracy over the internet, satellite and cable piracy, and the general availability of counterfeit goods in the marketplace. So these are essentially countries that want to get into a trade agreement with us who are systemic IP violators. And we've got to, if we're going to have an agreement with them, we've got to make sure that they stop. Okay, I pressed one too many. We've got to focus on open and non-discriminatory government procurement. So a core principle of market-based trade is that government purchase should be made on the basis of best value, not on the basis of where the company resides. And yet, only one of the 8 TPP countries, Singapore, is a signator of the WTO government procurement agreement. You take a country like Malaysia. Malaysia's official policy is to use government procurement to support mercantilist national policy objectives, such as forcing the technology transfer from foreign to domestic industries, providing advantages to local companies in the service sector, and boosting Malaysia's export capabilities. We've got to make sure that these countries, the ones that have state-owned enterprises or state-supported enterprises, don't use that as an unfair advantage, as we see China doing currently in a systemic way. The U.S. National Intelligence Council's Global Trends 2025 argues that by 2025, state capitalism in the form of state-directed economies is likely to be a major threat to the U.S. economy. So unless we come and have real enforcement around the notion of competitive neutrality, that countries cannot use the advantages and unfair advantages to SOEs and SSEs, there will be a significant problem. Now, one of the problems here is that Treasury, who is quite influential in influencing USTR and trade agreements and has a strong voice at the table, Treasury has raised some questions about, should we be strong on these other countries because maybe they'd push back and say we shouldn't have Fannie Mae. Now my argument would be, boy, I wish they'd pushed back. Would have been a lot better off. But more seriously, look, at the end of the day, Treasury needs to understand what its priorities are. Its priorities are not to defend Treasury interests, they're to defend U.S. interests. And Treasury needs to basically say, our most important thing we can do is to defend American companies in multinational competition and not worry about whether somebody's going to push back on Fannie or Freddie. And besides, there are ways to include these kind of provisions in an agreement that would prevent that from happening anyway. Services trade liberalization. Services trade is growing faster than goods trade, and it's a key area to get right, in part because we have significant competitive strengths in the services sector. Yet, the National Trade Estimate Report on Foreign Trade Barriers notes that almost every would-be TPP partner places significant barriers on trade and services. Chile restricts U.S. asset fund management services. Malaysia restricts retail trade. I remember recently when I was in India, it was striking to me that we'll let almost any Indian company invest in the U.S., but Walmart is not allowed. Excuse me. Walmart is not allowed to go into India and just open up a store. They have to do a joint venture because of restrictions on foreign trade, on investment. New Zealand and Peru have barriers to competition in wireless communications, in part through high mobile termination rates. So we've got to do better there. Market access. Market access is really at the core of what free trade is about. Somebody produces something, they should be able to get into other markets to be able to sell that in an open and non-discriminatory way. And yet, a number of the countries in this potential agreement have significant restrictions. Again, to use the example of Malaysia, Malaysia imposes restrictions on motor vehicle imports through a permit system that limits the number of vehicles that can be sold in that are produced outside the market. A number of countries place limits on the ability of foreign pharmaceutical manufacturers to distribute innovative biopharmaceutical products in the country. And last, eliminating non-tariff barriers. We see a lot of non-tariff barriers in these countries. One particular one is restrictions on foreign ownership. In Australia, for example, they have caps on foreign ownership in telecommunications. Malaysia has caps on foreign ownership in banks. And I can't go back, okay. And so what do we need to do? At the end of the day, we would argue there's really no need for a quick win here. And unfortunately, American politics has turned trade into a very politicized issue. There was recently a Republican candidate for president who criticized the president, President Obama, for not signing any trade agreements. Now, if you put that kind of political pressure on any administration, they're going to sign an agreement. The real question is not, has the Obama administration signed an agreement? If that's the goal, we can sign an agreement tomorrow. The question is, do you sign a good agreement? And I think when we focus on trade, it's always this sort of, have we signed an agreement? That's not the right way to frame it. The right way to frame it is, have we signed a really good agreement that's going to protect U.S. interests? So rather than rushing to meet some kind of artificial deadline, U.S. negotiators, in our view, should take the time to make sure that this is an ironclad gold standard agreement that really does set the stage, something akin to how USTR focused and made the Korea agreement a much stronger agreement. And lastly, I would just argue that, there we go. For those of you who don't know who that guy is, that's John Baptiste Colbert, who's the Minister of Finance from 1665 to 1683 in France, and is sort of seen as the father of mercantilism. So I think really at the end of the day, we should also be thinking about not just a TPP, but a TAP. We really need, in our view, to form a much stronger alliance with the Ricardian countries rather than the Colbertian countries. I don't mean the Colbert Show. I mean countries like, or regions like Europe, like Canada, countries or regions that essentially are based on market-based trade. If we don't form much stronger alliances with those countries as a way to have a counterweight against countries like China and other mercantilist countries, I think it's going to be very, very hard to do that. So we would argue that we need to make sure that the TPP is a gold standard, and at the same time, we need to be going forward with a much stronger alliance with an alliance of the free traders, if you will. So with that, Brent.
I love the picture.
Yeah, that's good.
Sadly, forces me to recall that the two leading institutions of global economic governance until recently were headed by French socialists, which is never a good thing.
And one of them has some problems.
Yeah,
Yeah, one of them
exactly.
had a little problem.
Yeah, Lamy is in trouble. Well, thank you very much, Rob. I'm always excited about being at ITIF, in part because I love the work that Rob does, and but also it's because, in one sense, the debate about trade in the country is always about the leading edge of the economy and the trailing edge of the economy. And to be honest, we spend an awful lot of time talking about the trailing edge of the economy, and it's thwarted our ability to articulate a decent trade policy. We need to spend more time thinking about how we take care of the leading edge of the economy as we go out and negotiate agreements. And as a part of that, that means recognizing what globalization has done to trade and done to competition among companies. And unfortunately, Rob is exactly right that the approach that we are taking to the TPP does not do that. It fails to do that. One of the interesting things I think about the paper is not only is it a very useful extension of the work that Rob and Stephen have done so usefully in sort of identifying innovation mercantilism as an issue. And that helps because it gets you thinking a little bit differently about how we ought to approach solutions. But also what I found fascinating about it is the extent to which it highlights something which nobody speaks of, which is there really is a competition among very different economic models going on in Asia, in the most economically dynamic region in the world. I don't have to name names, you guys can fill in the blanks when I describe them, but one is a model that's based on open and contestable markets, on rewards to innovation, on building what should be an entrepreneurial economy and focusing on that. And the rules of the international system or any agreement should undergird that, not only because that happens to be the environment in which our companies compete, but also happens to serve the people at the bottom of the pyramid best. And so we shouldn't lose sight of going back to, Colbert versus Ricardo, that this was originally a moral philosophy, not a science. So Rob's more of a philosopher than any of us lawyers. I think it's the best way to put it. But the important thing about that is to remember that open and contestable markets, the rewards to innovation, the ability to leave the field open to entrepreneurs, anybody who has a good idea, who has access to capital, can find a way to bring that to the market. That's the thing that serves the people at the bottom of the pyramid, not only in this country, but across the world. So at the end of the day, that's the goal that we should always be pursuing in trade. And what I think Rob is highlighting is that there's now a competition between that model, another model that is largely based on state-owned enterprises and guanji. So it is your political connections, and it is competition that is always with a state-owned enterprise with access to a very deep set of pockets. And in head-to-head, that does make a difference. One of the startling things, which I would have thought we would have learned this lesson from the woes of the steel industry. I've had to be a part of trying to find ways to protect the steel industry at times. And I got to tell you, it was never the right solution. But the right argument that I always felt our friends in the steel industry made was, once somebody else had subsidized their steel industry, that capacity stayed in the market. It took a very long time for the market to squeeze that out once that subsidized competition was in place. And it was often at the expense of market-based competitors rather than, in fact, seeing that stuff that was subsidized be the one who took the axe at the end of the day. So that's what's at issue. Now, the other model, frankly, is family-owned firms behind very high tariff walls, a very conventional mercantilist model. And, under those circumstances, the ability of those family-owned enterprises to essentially demand a partnership from an American company for that American company to find its way into a market in this day and age is deeply inconsistent with the basis of competition, as well as what's good for folks in those countries, not just in terms of the United States. So I think the best of what Rob has done is highlight there really is this fundamental competition about models, and we should take that seriously in how we approach these agreements, which is why I'm very much in favor of saying, don't hit an artificial deadline with this. Let's step back and let's consider what we really have to do. Now, in the context of the approach to the TPP itself, obviously it purports now to be a 21st century trade agreement. But that's true only by virtue of the fact that we're in the 21st century, to be honest with you. If you actually look at what we've done, we've taken several steps back in fundamental areas like intellectual property investment from the high water mark of where we have been before in terms of U.S. advocacy. And when we step back from the kinds of protections we had once fought for on IP and on investment, what we are doing, frankly, is we are walking away from trying to vindicate the values and the models under which our companies already compete. And so if what we're really trying to do is promote their interests, as well as I pointed out, create a model that serves the best interests of development, economic growth, we ought to be back where we were and, frankly, going further in terms of expecting IP protection and expecting investment protection. Because ultimately what those two, they're sort of emoluments of what I would eventually describe as something which is supply chain neutrality. In other words, wherever you source globally, particularly with respect to innovation, that should not hinder your ability to get into a market. I want the clusters in the United States that develop technology to have access to these markets. I don't want them to have to cough up their technology as a point of access or find a global company that says, sorry, I can't source from you because you don't want to give up your technology. I'm going to have to go elsewhere to source. So ultimately what I want to see is deep into the supply chain where we reach and pull companies in America through the global guys who are essentially the systems integrators rather than purely multinational companies, to have them serve a role that really is as an advocate for trying to bring all that innovation through to the markets. This is going to be one of the important features of 21st century competition. What that requires, though, from the point of view of the administration and what it pursues, is actually to understand that globalization has fundamentally changed the way we trade, and it's fundamentally changed the way companies compete. I'm old enough that when I grew up, trade was still, by and large, an arm's length transaction between independent buyers and sellers. And now 50% or more of trade takes place simply within corporations and their affiliates, a much higher percentage within the broader reach of their supply chains. And indeed, you know, given what we all know about costs, so I'm going to try and pretend I'm an economist here, you know, what we've done is we've lowered the transaction cost so more and more activities can be done on a contract basis rather than having to take place inside a corporation. But what that should lead us to think about is what the supply chain is. And when we're negotiating, it's not just on behalf of the company that comes in to represent their interests. They are representing everything that's going on deep in the supply chain in the United States, and we should be thinking all the way to that root as we're thinking about the kind of vision we want to articulate in a trade agreement. And what that requires us to think about is that the basis of competition among companies now is about largely capital, talent, and ideas. And unless we are trying to do things in the trading system and the rules we write that ensure the ability of our companies to compete fairly on that basis, which I tell you goes back to the sorts of things like high standard IP protection, trying to make sure that there's neutrality in terms of innovation in the supply chain. Unless we do that, we will have failed actually to vindicate the interests of both American firms and American workers, because it's always the guys in the third tier who suffer most. Frankly, the guys who are the global players will find a workaround. We'll suffer because the research triangle will no longer be relevant, because the big guys won't be able to pull them through unless we solve the problem that Rob has rightly identified. The last thing, of course, is I think that what that means is we need to expand the field of vision of the TPP. And what I mean by that is we should stop thinking of this as a conventional trade agreement, and we should lose the bullshit term, the 21st century trade agreement. What we should be doing is saying we are here to set a model for defining the legal underpinnings of a global market economy, and we are going to start in the most economically diverse and dynamic region in the world where it matters most. If we want world growth, if we want job creation, not just in the United States, but more generally, this is the kind of agreement we have to look for. No artificial deadline, as Rob points out. The most important thing is to set the highest possible standards in this agreement and then try and use the magnetic force to pull other people into it. I'm a big believer you don't push China anywhere. Nobody pushes the United States anywhere. You can invite them in, as we did with the WTO. Certainly that improved standards and it improved competition. It didn't go far enough, like any sort of accession agreement can't in the WTO, because of the nature of what the WTO currently focuses on, which is still by and large industrial tariffs. Having said that, we now need to have a vision that reaches beyond that. The other thing I'd say is, at a bare minimum, it means taking up many of the things that Rob has rightly identified, first in the good, the bad, and the ugly and self-destructive report, but also in the more recent paper, And that's, the NTMs, it's investment, it's IP, it's state-owned enterprises, for which I'm convinced we actually need a code. I don't think it's simple. We can't just expand the existing provisions that we have on state-owned enterprises in the WTO. We actually need something like the government procurement code that really articulates the basis of competition so that the markets will be open and contestable and that there's a way to push back when you find that somebody has access to a deeper pool of capital, or they can pull something with their friends at the NDRC in China and get you to cough up your technology. That has to be the goal, actually. And then lastly, going back to my earlier point about supply chain neutrality, I wrote a book a couple years ago about globalization of the American worker. And there's a whole host of suite of activities we ought to be doing to try and make sure that American workers can be competitive. But to be honest, if we don't set an architecture that vindicates the ability of entrepreneurs and the jobs they create to find a market globally, all the stuff that I wrote about retraining workers is irrelevant, right? It's a little bit like saying the seeds of all economic growth are microeconomic, but don't forget you got to have a decent macroeconomic policy to let all that happen. All those good things we'd like to do to try and pull people in from the margin, allow the workers to compete in the 20th century, depend on vindicating these values in a trade agreement that reaches well beyond the contours of the TPP. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Grant. Brian, you might want to pull that a little closer.
Okay. Well, thanks, Rob. Although I'm not going to thank you for putting me after Grant. It's a very hard act to follow on these matters. And thanks for the opportunity to be here and to be here on the panel with two old friends who I really admire and look up to and feel like I learn from whenever I talk with them. So I will offer some of my own meager comments. First, if I can offer any, I think all of us here will likely agree with much of what you have in your report and much of what you just said right now. If I can offer any criticism, I would say I think it almost seems as if you place a little bit too much responsibility at the feet of trade agreements. I mean, they are creatures of paper and words, but trade is really about people, and it's not the institutions themselves who do trade. It's people, and they'll find ways around rules. They'll get around rules, and the WTO institution is very helpful for what it goes. As far as the WTO goes, I think it's been pretty good. It certainly has its limits, but it also doesn't operate in isolation. The trading system is not just about the rules the WTO creates. It's about human interactions at just bilateral meetings we have at SNED or the JCCT. We've got obviously the FTAs, but there are all kinds of forums in which G8 meetings where the sorts of trade problems and trade irritants we have are addressed extra WTO. So I think for the purpose for which the WTO is created, more or less, it's done okay. If I can offer any criticism of the WTO, and it leads into intellectual property. I think the WTO, especially this round, has allowed the idea to take root that development means allowing developing countries to keep high tariffs and to keep trade barriers. And I think similarly on intellectual property, the idea that somehow strong intellectual property protections is anti-development or hurts developing countries is just a really bad, pernicious idea that we should try to stamp out if we can. In fact, to my mind, strong intellectual property protections is probably the greatest vehicle we can have to encourage growth and development in the developing world. But nevertheless, so the WTO, I think, has been fine as far as it goes. And one more criticism I'd offer, actually, it's almost that I feel like your paper criticizes the WTO for not addressing certain issues or its inability to address certain issues. I would actually argue a major criticism I have of the WTO is that they've actually taken power in areas where they shouldn't have. Specifically in diffuse settlement on cases like zeroing or the Byrd Amendment. Whatever you think of those as policies, I pretty well damn guarantee you that's not what the U.S. negotiators agreed to back in 1994. But you have a bunch of civil law judges up there who have grasped that power. I think that's a real criticism. I think the TPP is a great opportunity to rethink trade agreements. And actually, I sort of think about it, maybe this is not right, but I think about it in the context of giving true reality to the Bogor conceptions of, an APEC-wide free trade agreement. So I'm excited about it in those terms. I think, and honestly, I think USTR has done a pretty impressive job, to be honest, and not to be Pollyanna-ish. Those of you in the room who know me, and there are many, will be surprised that I'm actually being optimistic here, so pessimistic. But I think USTR really has. They've done some very creative thinking. TPP, as envisioned by USTR, actually raises a lot of these issues that you discuss in the report. There's still some concerns, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But first, really the good stuff. I think the most interesting thing that USTR is working on is this idea of regulatory coherence. I think it's actually very smart, and in some ways I wonder why we really hadn't thought of it before. This is really the way to try to tackle non-tariff barriers. You can, a lot of the companies who I work with and represent, and we all know about, are not complaining so much about the tariffs that they're facing these foreign markets. It's about government action that in some form or fashion is keeping them out of the market or restricting their ability to act. These are regulations, and a lot of times the regulations that are passed or put into place, frankly, at the request of domestic competitors to keep foreign companies out of the market. This sort of regulatory coherence exercise, I think, will help minimize that activity. And I think it'll also give a lot of better clarity to U.S. companies who will often, in foreign markets, face competing requirements from regulators with overlapping responsibilities. So sometimes U.S. companies don't know really how to work in foreign markets. And I think this idea of regulatory coherence, I think, will help with that. USTR is thinking along the lines that you mentioned, Grant, in terms of supply chain management, or I think they call it business facilitation competitiveness. Thinking this is a way, I think, and I don't know if USTR is thinking about it in these terms, but really a way to get to what you're talking about, a new way to negotiate trade agreements. Because every chapter has its negotiator, and you go and you negotiate, and you've got rules and rules of origin and market access. You don't necessarily, and they're all, of course, part of the same team. But that's not really how business works. And I wonder, and I'm wondering out loud here, if there's a better way to even structure the negotiations, and could it be put in place in the TPP more to reflect the way that business thinks about these matters, and wouldn't that be more meaningful for U.S. businesses? There are other matters that are the USTR is considering in the context of TPP. Some are more political, I would argue. They've got this idea of some green issues. Although I will say, just a shout out there for fishery subsidies. Doesn't get a lot of play, but I actually think it's really important. I think it's a terrible idea. I'm really excited about the idea of limiting fishery subsidies. But that, it's a micro level thing. There are other things. Advancing small and medium-sized enterprises, it's a real priority for a lot of the Obama administration. I'm just not sure how you do that in a trade agreement, to be honest. And it seems to me, if anything, the small and medium-sized enterprises are just extra hurt by the things that hurt bigger companies, because they're a lot less able to cope with them, fewer resources, less experience, and specifically one issue in particular that I really hope the TPP addresses, which is corruption, right? I mean, big companies are able to deal with this. It's endemic around the world. U.S. companies are quite properly and quite restrained from how they work in these foreign markets. But obviously our foreign competitors are not. And small companies are just totally incapable of really dealing with this in a meaningful way. And I think if the TPP can help address that, I think that would be really a great thing. I think TPP, as envisioned by USTR, and I keep using this phrase, as envisioned by USTR, because of course this is a negotiation. And you've got really maybe for the first time since NAFTA, maybe, but even then, I wouldn't say, you've really got such a wide range of levels of development in the TPP. It's, I think, going to be a really daunting exercise. And it's not just me, right? Everybody thinks it. All the countries, just the sheer number of countries. But then when you add in the different levels of development and all the various issues that they have internally, their politics in addition to our own, this is really a daunting exercise. I will say I don't think that there is an artificial timeline. I think they want to have an outline, a framework. It may have been 6 months or a year ago where the administration was talking about having a deal by November. I think that was a total impossibility when they said it. But they've definitely backed off from that. Now I think they're thinking, well, we want to get as much done as we can by November, so we can talk about it. I've heard our negotiators say many times, look, substance is going to drive the timing, which I think is exactly the right approach. I think we'd all agree with. Some of the things that you mentioned in the report, Rob, I think are exactly the right things to talk about. The need to discipline state-owned enterprises. This is a gigantic issue, not just for the future, but frankly right now, and especially in the context of the TPP. I think there are 3 of the TPP countries who have really significant state activity in the private economy through state-owned enterprises or otherwise, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. And how you address that, I think, is really going to be one of the hardest problems to address in the TPP. There's been a lot of great thinking on these issues, on state-owned enterprises. I know USTR is thinking how to deal with this, but I'm optimistic they will at least try to do this. Sure. One thing that you mentioned, I was happy to see in the paper. I haven't really heard USTR talk too much about this, but this is currency, which obviously is an issue that has consumed in some ways in some quarters of our U.S. politics the last few years. But let's be honest, it does matter. It matters to trade flows. Whatever you think about the various proposals to deal with how China manages its currency, currency matters in trade flows. And it seems to me the TPP is an opportunity to find some way to add further disciplines, because of course I believe the IMF, certainly IMF treaty, I think probably even the WTO does say something about currency, just not in a very meaningful way, and maybe TPP provides that opportunity. But other issues where I feel like it's an opportunity for us, and I would say I think the administration is quite open to other ideas. So if you've got bright ideas, come and bring it to them, because they really do want to make this a new model agreement. I give them credit for really trying to push the envelope, and I do think there's all this creative thinking. I think they're thinking about ag biotech, for instance. Here's an issue, not so much looking forward like state-owned enterprises, but frankly looking back. We've had horrible problems with market access in agricultural biotech. Here's a way to provide disciplines for market access for ag biotech in the largest, fastest growing region of the world. So maybe we can avoid some of the problems we've had in some of these other markets. Let me just say a word, though. Those are all the positives. So I think USTR is trying to do well. I wish I could wave a magic wand and we'd all be on the Jetsons flying our cars and doing whatever. And we'd have a brand new model trade agreement. But I think it just by necessity, it has to be incremental in nature. And I think USTR is doing quite a good job trying to do that. I wouldn't have said that necessarily a few months ago, but I think they've really made a ton of progress. But one of the issues that I really am worried about, and I just say a minute or two if I can, or a minute, since you said 2 minutes, like 2 minutes to me ago. And that's intellectual property. This is obviously the most controversial of issues, have not yet been tabled by the United States. They would like to table what I'll call the May 10th issues on intellectual property, as well as some of the digital media provisions on June 20th, or by June 20th for Vietnam. This is an issue I work on personally, in full disclosure, for some clients. And what has amazed me in the debate here is that we are not instinctively saying, okay, we're going to table the strongest, highest standards of protection for pharmaceutical companies and content providers that we've had in any of our trade agreements, because boy, that's where the real dollars are for us. And that's not what we're doing, and we're not doing that not because our trading partners are insisting that. Our trading partners are largely sitting back and watching us have this internal conversation where we're kicking the shit out of each other about, well, no, we've got to offer less, weaker standards. And I hear often this concept of balance. We need to balance. We need to balance the pharmaceutical interests with, I don't know what's on the other side of the equation, to be honest with you. And it gets back to what I said earlier, this idea that I think is allowed to take root, that strong IP is somehow anti-development. And I think exactly the opposite. I think USTR and the administration are trying to find a way to manage their domestic politics, which is really what this is all about, I think, and trying to find a way that'll work for industry here in the United States. Again, I give them a lot of credit for this, but I worry about where we're going to end up, to your point.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Karan.
Great. Thanks very much, Rob. I'm going to start by stating what my wife reminds me of every morning, which is that I speak for myself here and no one else. And even in that, she occasionally, I don't in fact do that. I'm also reminded of a comment by a fellow colleague of mine when I was in the administration who said at the end of an interview, if I said anything controversial, I didn't mean it. Look, and I say that because, in fact, I think this is a great topic. It's a fabulous paper, and it puts on the table very squarely an issue, I think, that may, in fact, get a little controversial, which is, and to cut to the chase, whether once you put up this great ideal and we can't get it, what do we do? And I think that's the issue that I would like to wrestle with a little bit here today. Let me start, though, with the premise. You know, it's interesting, having been in the administration, been in the USTR, now being in the private sector. You know, my perspective of the biggest challenge that we face right now is not any one of these individual things, because I do think each of them is critically important, but it's the fact that for the past 4 years, we as a country have been standing on the sidelines of global trade. You know, we have not been out, we have not been engaged, we have been viewed in capital around the world as disengaged and fundamentally as uncommitted to global trade negotiations, trade liberalization. And that not only has undermined, I think, our ability to impact what's going on in those negotiations themselves, but has also had, I think, an impact on U.S. businesses as they have sought to penetrate international markets around the world. It's a sense of government being aligned with business, and when government is not out there actively engaged in fast-growing markets, it means that business is not interested in being actively engaged in these markets. And so I think my first priority, more important than anything else, is that the United States has to be back in the trade negotiating business. Now, TPP in that regard, I think is critically important. I think it is key. It's key not only because it's the only trade negotiation that we've really got going right now, and I put Doha in the category of things that I don't think is going to come to fruition, and in any event is not the form of trade negotiation that we're talking about here. But I think it's key because of what it potentially signals in terms of the United States being back fighting for American business and labor interests in penetrating international markets that are going to be absolutely critical to economic growth inside the United States. So, you know, and to cast my mind back actually to 2006, 2007, when I was in the administration and when we were making a very conscious choice about whether we join what was then called the P4, which became the TPP, it was done very much with a mindset to two things. One was to doing exactly what you put forward here, creating an alliance with like-minded trading partners. You know, you had at that point in time Singapore, New Zealand, Brunei, Chile. You had perhaps, you know, some of the most forward-leaning market-oriented economies in the world. And the thought was, let's really set the highest of high standard and then let others accrue. But you also had in mind there is a huge fight going on and will go on between the major trading powers for influence in these markets and the region that it represents, effectively the Asia-Pacific region. And we've got to have a horse. We've got to have a dog in that fight. And the TPP became that dog. And so the critical importance of TPP, in my mind, is not just that we accomplish a good agreement, but that we accomplish an agreement, that we do come to closure. Because if the United States launches a trade agreement, another trade agreement, if it is the only agreement that we've got going, and if we fail to bring it to conclusion, then I think our credibility, quite frankly, as an international negotiating force, is going to be further undermined. And I think that is in no one's best interest. So I think there is, perhaps to counterbalance some of the views you put forward, a really important interest in seeing this agreement succeed and bringing it to conclusion. One other sort of observation about the TPP, and this ties back into, I think, some of the points you were making. I do think it is important. I agree with Grant. The idea of it being a 21st century agreement is sort of a nice label to stick on it, and I'm not sure it has that much consequence. I do think what is important, and this I think was reflected both in Brian's and Grant's comments, is that it be an agreement that addresses some of the big fundamental challenges that American businesses and the United States faces in international markets. And I think some of those challenges have changed in the 5 years since we've really been out of the trade negotiating business. And I'll come back to what I think the biggest of those big challenges are, but I do think it represents a important opportunity for us to stop, recalibrate, figure out which of these things really is the most important in the pecking order, and then go after those with special fervor. Look, to go through your agreement, you know, it's interesting. I go through each of these provisions that are put forward in the paper, and I say, yep, agree with that, agree with that, agree with that, agree with that, and then I come to the very conclusion, and I pause. And I pause not because I fundamentally disagree that I would love to have all of these things in a trade agreement. I would love to have them in. But I pause because I look at the dynamics of this negotiation, and I look at what we even went through with Korea and Malaysia, which were the last two agreements that we negotiated. And I suspect strongly you're not going to get all of these things in an agreement. You're not going to. And particularly the more you involve other partners, the more you move from the P4 to the P9, which is where we are today, the more we are going to have to pick and choose. And the world that we existed in, that we lived in a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago, where the United States with a small group of companies came into negotiations, laid down the terms of the negotiations, and simply had foreign governments sign up to them, have passed. Tectonic shifts have happened in global economics. The trade negotiation dynamic needs to reflect that and is reflecting that. We no longer, it's not like Malaysia and Vietnam have no other choices in terms of trading partners out there anymore. The Chinese and others are very actively courting them. So we need to structure trade negotiating tactics and policy and goals that correspond to the economic realities out there. What I would say, and I just a further thought on this, is that you are seeing those tectonic shifts affecting trade negotiating dynamics not just in Doha or not just in some of the other trade negotiations out there, but indeed in business practices day in, day out. In fact, some of the challenges that we're seeing out there, some of the challenges, for instance, about American companies being forced to transfer technology to gain market access. You know, the reality is that 3 decades ago, American companies simply wouldn't have put up for that, would not have done that. And they wouldn't have done it because they wouldn't have needed to. But the reality is that is happening, and it's happening because that's where the growing markets are, right? They're making the trade to engage in business practices because they need to do so to be able to capture the growth of those markets. Now, don't get me wrong, American companies and multinational companies are very smart. They know exactly where the crown jewels are, and they are managing their assets as effectively as you would imagine them to. But some of the issues that we're talking about here as trade issues would not be trade issues, would not be business or commercial issues, were there not for these tectonic shifts that have actually happened. So anyway, I would agree with the list of priorities that are put up there. The question becomes, what do you do when you can't get everything, right? How do you prioritize? How do you rack and stack? Where do you make the compromises? Because the one thing I don't think we want to do is sit and wait till we get the perfect agreement. Because I think if you do sit and wait till you get the perfect agreement where every last constituency in the United States has gotten what they want or has not been harmed, you will not get an agreement. So how do you rack and stack? And in my mind, and I say this because I look at this list of things, and now from the perspective of my company or perhaps many other companies out there, every one of those things is good. Every one of those things helps us. We care about IP. We care about services liberalization. Certainly care about tariffs and non-tariff barriers. But if I had to prioritize the 2 most important issues in this, it comes back to some of the things that we talked about here. It's the challenges posed by state-owned enterprises and government procurement. And it's because, in my mind, those represent the biggest challenge that we're seeing happening in the global economic stage, which is the rise of state capitalism It is the growth of governments engaging as commercial competitors with businesses out there. It is effectively a dichotomy between two different models of economic governance. And the question is going to be which wins. And I can live with a little bit less market access. I can live with a little bit less, IP protection. I hate to, but I can. But what I cannot live with is a world where the whole playing field is skewed, and where my competitor is my regulator and for that matter, the entity that's going to be funding my competitor and everything else. So if I had to prioritize, those are the top two of my list. I would put that out there as the absolute mandate. And if we can't get that, then I think we need to fundamentally think about how we move forward to the venture. I guess just a last quick point, and I see I'm down to my last minute. I do worry a little bit about the proposal that we eliminate countries from the TPP. Your suggestion that there are some of these countries that are now in the P9 dynamic that shouldn't be there because of where they fall potentially on the Section 301 list. I think at this point in time we are where we are, right? We've launched this negotiation. I think it's critically important that we bring it to a close. And I think if we can get these countries to sign up to a lot of the protections we're talking about here, that's ultimately going to be a good thing. And it's going to move the global trading dynamic dramatically in a direction that we want to. And I think it will redefine where international trade negotiations go. So I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you to all three. Those are great comments, helpful comments. I just want to respond very quickly to those, and then we'll open it up. I don't have any comments with Grant said. I agree with everything Grant said. So she agreed with everything I said.
I wasn't hard enough on you.
I know you weren't. You weren't. With regard to Brian made a couple points about us maybe being a little too tough on the WTO. Just to be clear, our complaint about the WTO is really threefold. One is the entire nature of it hasn't been able to include enough real protection. So it's not a criticism of the WTO itself, it's the process. Currency should be much stronger and much more enforceable in the WTO, for example, than it is. But the complaints about the actual people at the WTO, or the WTO as an institution, is one, I believe they're too Solomonic. Your point there. I mean, they feel like they have to, anytime they attack somebody else, they have to attack us. And because we want to be balanced. And look, at the end of the day, we are so much better, and the UK is so much better, and there are countries that are just better, and there are countries that are much, much worse. And the WTO needs to come to grips with that and stop the political correctness that they do. And the third thing, I guess, was I just don't see the WTO as being really what we would say full-throated advocates for, full-throated opponents of mercantilism. They just don't talk about it. You know, when you listen to the WTO leadership, they're so concerned about trade wars and blocking trade. And it's almost like they're engaged in this sort of facade, this sort of, well, let's pretend that this stuff isn't going on, because if we don't look at it, we don't look behind the curtain, everything will be fine. The reality is everything is not fine. There are these systemic problems. WTO needs to be upfront and say that there are these problems and not worry that if you admit it, that there will be a trade war. I point out what Brian said about IP. I guess, you know, and maybe building on Karan, I agree with you. I mean, we're trying to set the bar higher. You know, we're not trade negotiators. We don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Our goal is to say, here's what we want. Here's what we think we should do. You guys figure it out. So in that sense, we are trying to, you know, push as much as we can, and I get that. You know, not going to get everything. You added SOEs and procurement. I agree with that. I really would put in IP and tech transfers. Those are the three core things of that three-legged stool. And I think in 25 years when they write the book, they'll either write the book on the how America turned it around and regained its innovation leadership, or how did America lose it and just go down to be some of the UK of the 21st century.
And now I know what a 21st century trade agreement is.
There you go. I don't mean to criticize the UK. I think they're actually doing big. But if you look at the UK, they were an industrial powerhouse, and they lost almost all of it. And they lost it because of policy failures. And if when they write that book, if it's the bad story, one of the stories that there will be a chapter in that book that will say, why did the U.S. have these internal conflicts to give up on IP? Why did they just let other people just walk away with it? And it'll all be the thing, well, because we had this sort of guilt complex about other countries, and we felt it was fair if we give them this stuff. And look, at the end of the day, this is about a competition. This is about a battle. This is about defending our interests. You know, 30 years ago, And 50 years ago and 30 years, you had U.S. trade negotiators, you had U.S. presidents who actually argued things like, oh yeah, we can give the Egyptians a pharmaceutical plant. We're rich. What difference does it make? You know, those days are gone, and we got to recognize it. And this is the last point. You know, I think one of the ways, Karan, to sort of deal with your concern is we should be opening up other agreement fronts. We shouldn't be putting all our eggs in this basket. So when there's this pressure, oh my God, we got one thing going, and if it doesn't work, it's like, you know, then you're over the barrel. We got to have a bunch of things that we're negotiating. And the second thing I think is also we shouldn't just be in the negotiation business. We should be in the enforcement business. And I would just say that's one area I think USTR could do more on. And I think part of it is a funding issue, and they need to get more resources to be able to do that. But I think, you know, we've got to be doing lots of different things and pushing the bar as high as we can. So with that, why don't we if you have questions or comments, if you just want to raise your hand and then identify who you are. And, yeah.
Thanks. I'm Rob Warren. I would like to try to get a picture of APEC in this context. The U.S. has committed a lot to APEC. It's been our #1 Asia-Pacific effort. Hasn't gone very far, but it has improved, I guess, business facilitation. How does TPP fit in with APEC, and how could TPP be the groundwork for a broader arrangement with the Asia-Pacific?
I'm happy to take a first shot at that. I actually, in my spare time,
Your mic is on.
Yeah, it's on. Somehow happened to have landed the position of being the chairman of the National Center for APEC, which is a mouthful of an acronym, the NCAPEC, but it basically consists of the U.S. companies that care about and support APEC. So I think the relationship between TPP and APEC is a very close one, obviously, right? You've got the members of the TPP right now are all APEC members. And there's the general sense that APEC as an institution exists to promote economic trade liberalization within the Asia-Pacific region. And in my mind, there was always sort of a wedding cake approach to this, right? That you would take the small core group of most firmly committed free traders, have them at the core, and then expand out with subsequent iterations of the agreement or adding on to the agreement with those larger spans, those bigger pieces of the wedding cake, or tiers of the wedding cake being other APEC members. So that ultimately you would get to what we called, or had called a free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific, FTAP. So I guess my thought would be there's a very close relationship. TPP technically I think is outside of the APEC framework. It's not something that gets discussed or embraced by the APEC ministers. It actually, the P4 was launched as I think something called a pathfinder by the APEC group. It was an initial initiative by a small group of them. But look, substantively, the reality is if this comes together, if we can secure that important agreement, it will become the new benchmark for trade liberalization in the Asia-Pacific region, which, as you know, constitutes more than 50% of the global economy. Hugely important in that context that if this agreement gets done, and it is a good agreement, it will become, I think, a very powerful sort of leveling force in APEC.
No.
Deborah Miller. I have a question. Does the TPP address the issue of capital controls? Many of the bits did. Given the region, it would be a little surprising if it did, although interesting. And in the wake of the financial crisis, the wisdom about liberalizing the capital account has been looked at again. I mean, even the IMF in the spring wondered, should it continue to push for liberalization of all capital accounts? So I'm wondering if that's in the TPP at all, that issue is addressed.
Right.
To all three people. I was looking
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, it's always a part of the conversation.
Yeah.
In two areas. One, in terms of the negotiations we have about investment, and the negotiations that we have about financial services. And in some respects, having been very strong advocates for liberalization of the capital account, that was sort of baked into the cake. Unfortunately, you don't have that at the forefront of this administration's thinking. And there has been certainly a departure. I might suggest this is one of those areas where having a French socialist at the top of the IMF may not be particularly helpful. But you have had people reconsider capital controls. And the problem with that is that capital controls become too easy an excuse for other sorts of bad economic policies. So I'm not saying that there aren't times when capital controls might not be useful, but what's happened is that we have forsaken any sort of control or discipline on them at this stage, with the IMF walking away from, you know, its traditional position, which I got to say took a long time to get the IMF to adopt. And the reason I'm frightened by that is that, you know, from the point of view of somebody who has been looking at trade for 30 years, it took a very long time for those of us on the trade side to get the IMF out of the business of advocating stuff that was fundamentally anti-free trade. And now that they're back in the business in some respects of encouraging governments to adopt market interventions, that is not a good thing. And so at the end of the day, you know, I can understand wanting to leave some room for that, but we're simply not advocates for any sort of disciplined approach to capital controls at this point. And I got to say, you know, given our role in the financial crisis, we don't have a lot of credibility. So that was probably more of an answer than I needed or wanted.
I was wondering if we give either of the other two gentlemen.
Why don't we, maybe we, less of a pressing need, okay, why don't we keep going with this
Hey,
question?
Jennifer Mulvaney with HP. I'm going back to Brian's fantasy of having a magic wand in his Jetson mobile. If you kind of look at the way we negotiate our FTAs from a U.S. perspective, and I think Rod would have a perspective given his time at USTR, we kind of have this model that we just kind of keep starting over. We have our buckets in our FTAs, we have our offices at USTR, they kind of jigger themselves around every now and then. But does that model still work? And to Rob's point on mercantilism, we have a whole office at USTR that's dedicated solely to textiles and apparel. I mean, does that, I mean, how, that's just one example, but I mean, that doesn't seem to make sense. So how do you go about moving into a 21st century agreement or whatever we have, given that model that we have, and what is it going to take to kind of change that around?
That's to help the apparel firm we have in North Carolina.
The 5 people.
I'm kidding, no offense to the apparel firm.
Let me start. So many in this room know Gary Horlick, and he said something very funny the other day, I thought. He said, you know, if you look at kind of the dominant industry 30 or 40 years ago, then you'll know where USTR is really expending most of its efforts. That was very, very good. And you know, there's some truth to that.
So we just have to wait till 2040?
Yes.
Right. So you're of course absolutely right, and like I said, I mean, I wish that you know, human nature is such that we could just completely rewrite the slate and, you know, restructure the office and restructure the way we do trade negotiations. I feel like TPP they're trying to make baby steps in that way, especially with respect to the whole supply chain initiative. It's interesting, they're trying, but I just don't think I don't think that TPP at least is going to be that new model of trade agreement, but it may be a way station on the way.
Grant?
Yeah, actually, Brendan, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit about where USTR is. I think if you look at this in context, this administration lacks a coherent international economic policy. You can't at one and the same time suggest that we're trying to do something affirmative on trade, and at the same time you have a tax policy that is designed to penalize companies who are actually trying to compete abroad. And that lack of coherence really affects this sort of problem. So because you're absolutely right about where we need to go on the trade side, but we don't really have a vision of how we should assert America's interests. And certainly there has been a fundamental shift in a view of American exceptionalism, particularly on these issues. And what I worry about is that without sort of tackling this issue, and I got to say, this is a bipartisan comment, if you go up to Congress, my view is on both sides of the aisle, people are 40 years out of date in how they think about the global economy.
Absolutely.
They simply don't have a vision that's consistent with HP's interests, with GE's interests, or their supply chain. And in one sense, you actually need the kind of advocacy and leadership from the executive branch, because as you and I both know, you can't get it on the Hill. There's just too many players, you know. Or you need a finance committee chair and a ways and means committee chair thinking, let's just find a way to tip the bow of the boat back in and start making headway against the wind. And right now, that's missing. Unfortunately, that leadership isn't there. And I got to say, part of, Rob, I'm going to go on just a little bit, is that if you think about the TPP in that context, I really question whether the juice is worth the squeeze. And I know that's not what companies would say. Companies would say, it's the only thing going, we got to do it, we got to vindicate this, But the reality is that somebody who looked very much like me once had to tell Bob Zoellick that it was time to quit, doing FTAs with the outer asteroid belt. At some point you have to do, things that matter commercially. Otherwise, the politics become so hard. And now we're at a point where, if you think about how we're going to succeed bringing this trade agreement back through Congress, if we're going to get an agreement, with Vietnam as the outlier, you think the battle we'll have with labor over a trade agreement with Vietnam, you really have to wonder whether it's worth the effort if this is all that's on the table. Right?
Can I just on that? I mean, Grant, I don't disagree with you. I mean, and I think this goes back to Rob's point there, which is, what really should be our trade policy. We never launched TPP because we thought it was going to be the be-all and end-all. We thought it was going to be a very important bit of architecture, quite frankly, in that region, and important for that reason as a standard-setting mechanism. I don't think in our wildest dreams we ever thought it was going to be the only thing going, right? I honestly, I think if we had thought it was going to be the only thing going, we might still have done it, but we would have been darn disappointed about it, The reality of it is that, and you touch on this in, I think it's either this paper or the innovation paper, but there is clearly opportunities, it would seem to me, for other much more ambitious sort of trade negotiating efforts with like-minded partners out there that could yield substantial benefits. Unfortunately, we haven't been at that point. Some of it, I think, has to do with leadership. Some of it has to do with congressional constraints. So your magic wand question, there might be a variety of things we would end up redesigning. But I don't want to suggest that the TPP is the be-all and end-all in and of itself. It's an important piece, and it's particularly important because, unfortunately, where we stand today is it is the only trade negotiation we have going.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems that we've had, Corona, we've had this sort of tastes great, less filling debate. Either just more trade agreements with anybody or no trade agreements. And in fact, I think for the sort of some on the Democratic left who are more on the no trade agreements for anybody, I think one can make a compelling case to them that really aggressive efforts to have trade agreements with fellow free traders is really in our workers, American workers' interest, and getting that framework right and really moving the ball down the path. That also then gives us a little more negotiating power when we're doing these other things as well. So 100% agree that this notion we should just step back and, as EPI said, let's take a time out. I just don't think that is the right way to go. It puts us behind the 8 ball. Right back there, sir.
Yeah, hi, Stephen Jordan with Business Innovation Center. This is actually just a very curious question I've had for a while here. We've been dealing with the earthquake in Chile, the floods in Australia, the earthquake in Christchurch, the Japan debacle. How much is disaster risk reduction as trade policy or TPP being seen as a way to reduce the impact of disasters in terms of the Trans-Pacific context? Because, for example, we saw with Japan, the supply chain logistics issues start getting a lot more currency, and you're starting to see different countries trying to figure out, well, what can we do to incentivize R&D with such things as like early warning systems for disasters and stuff like that. Is any of the ring of fire issues, is any of that starting to inform any of this conversation at all? And could you make a case that in terms of supply chain integrity or strengthening up the Trans-Pacific relationship here, that this could actually feed into a disaster risk reduction agenda?
Yeah, and I just to reinforce Rob's basic point, I like what you're saying. And the surest way to do that is to end the idea of this growing idea of innovation mercantilism. And the reason I say that is that if you think about how Asia has succeeded, it has been based on the adoption of property rights, the enforcement of contracts, sort of underpinnings of a market economy, and integration with the global economy. If you think about indigenous innovation in China, it cuts against both of those things. It separates China from its integration in the global economy, and it cuts against the idea of property rights and enforcement of contracts. If what you did was try and create a platform in the rest of Asia and the Pacific that allowed countries through innovation to find their place in the value chain rather than being pushed there by their government, you would actually see greater diversity and greater flexibility in the response on the commercial side. You would find more opportunities for business to use a risk reduction model rather than putting their eggs in one basket. And the indigenous innovation policy are designed to force companies to put their eggs in one basket in China.
Yeah, one last follow-up to that.
Actually, I'm sorry, I want to keep going. Maybe you can after the thing, because we're really running short of time, so maybe 3 more quick questions in the blue here.
I am Lisa Ariane with Apple. Returning to the point about TPP being the only game in town and other negotiations, I mean, I think it's a fact that there's a lot of energy being pent up by the fact that nobody will admit that Doha is probably not going to close. And I wonder if, so speaking about, we're bringing kind of some of your themes together, the WTO is not serving the purposes of the challenges in trade fully, and the fact that TPP is the only game in town. I mean, there's a lot of agreement ideas inside that are being basically stifled by the Doha, and ITA expansion is something that our sector has brought forward. There's now an open Federal Register notice from USTR about moving forward with the negotiation there. I mean, how can we break that logjam?
Pascal Lamy should run for the presidency of France. I'm dead serious. I mean, the reality is, I really like Pascal. He's an 85%er. If he grabs an issue like he always does, and the truth is in the first 85%, you're golden. If the truth lies in the other 15%, you're in real trouble. And with Doha, the truth lies in the other 15%. And it's dead. Something which, is very unpopular for me to say when I was still in the administration, but it's dead. And it was dead since 2002. So the reality is you've had this thing sort of blocking progress and debilitating to the WTO because it's running on fumes. The rules are actually more important these days than further knocking down of industrial tariffs. But to vindicate those rules, you actually have to be expanding the rules and deepening them on things like IP and investment. And that we can't do because they're not a part of the current agenda as a part of the Doha development round. And so, it's interesting because one way past that, and what I would submit is the only way the TPP can succeed is, and this will sound ironic given where the TPP started with the P4, but the only way it can succeed at this point is if you convince Vietnam to go well past China in embracing a market model. And the reason I say that is the politics here, but also it's convincing Vietnam that its future lies in outcompeting China on policy reform. And that's what creates the progress you want. You want them, they already are, to be honest, this is the Chinese fear, they have become the new south coast of China. The whole go west policy to get everything going, west of Chengdu all the way to Tibet has not worked. Enormously costly from the point of view of the Chinese government. But the only way this will succeed is if the Vietnamese fully buy onto that, and that means very strong IP standards, which has not been the case in Vietnam. It means very strong rules with respect to attracting investment, domestic investment as well as foreign investment. But I would suggest that that's where the work would have to be done if you want this to succeed, because I think you also have to create the underlying rules of a market economy with respect to labor to even be in the game in terms of the politics here of trying to bring that agreement back. So the irony is that if you were going to use this as a model, that's a very heavy lift and a very hard target. And I would certainly be thinking, sorry, Rob, one last point. The other thing is we get trapped into this idea that everything has to be done by USTR. But I will tell you honestly, if you think about the uncertainty and risk in commercial transactions and what's expanded trade, I would bet you that the signing of the UN Convention on the International Sale of Goods, pure private international law, nothing to do with USTR, has had as much effect on trade liberalization and expanding trade as anything we did in the Uruguay round. And the point is that there's a lot of issues that I think should be on the agenda, and there are a lot of other agencies that used to have an awful lot to do with our trade policy broadly writ, and we've kind of reduced it just to putting all of the pressure on USTR, which is unfair to USTR because their role is a certain role, and other people have to carry their weight. But I think we have to broaden our field of vision as well and start applying, Treasury needs to be an advocate on things like investment. Let's stop doing
Let me just
that.
add real quick. I think it also gets back to, Grant, what you said, which I also, as the only Democrat on the panel, I guess, wholeheartedly embrace, which is the idea that I think the administration is out of step with modern American business. And there are a lot of things that they could be doing, but they're not because it's not a priority, in my view.
Sure.
And clearly, where we stand, ITA, that's the most successful trade agreement that's ever been signed and has the biggest impact on productivity. The new McKinsey report just came out 2 days ago or yesterday on how IT has grown productivity and GDP around the world. Why we're not trying to expand ITA with more product classifications and more countries to me is I just don't understand that. That is such a big, big win we could have. We could get other countries involved in there. Comment there. Yes, ma'am, right here, and then here.
My name is Rebecca Taylor. I'm with the State Department. My question relates to the patent reform bill that's teetering on the edge of being passed. Specifically, the change from first to invent to first to file. Is that strengthening to our global intellectual property protection position or not?
Let me take this. I actually, so I've done a lot of work on the patent reform bill, and I'll say this: I represent a group of companies who focused on various issues in patent reform bill, and we had an event with a member of Congress, and we fully went in there expecting to talk about one issue, and she asked us about first to file, and she said, okay, for your companies, and these are largely, I'd say, medium-sized companies, they're not gigantic, huge multinational companies. She said, what do you think of first to file? And we went around the table, and all the people around the table said, yeah, we do sell internationally. We file overseas. So it's at bottom. It's probably a positive change for us. And then she said, no. I want to know personally, what do you think about the change to first to file? And to a person around the table, and remember, we didn't come to talk about this, but everybody said, yeah, actually, it's not a good thing for American innovation because it does. They could see, yeah, it does disadvantage the small guy. Invention, the process of invention is not linear, and it's maybe not a healthy thing. But I think it's a done deal. I mean, if the patent bill passes, this will be in it. There is a very vocal group of folks who are arguing against it, but I just think the ship has already sailed.
So the state-owned enterprises and their ability to file quickly on things that maybe American inventors have invented a few years prior is not something we should be worried about?
I think there's a lot we should be worried about. But like I said, I think that has actually been, more than anything, the driver of patent reform, to be honest.
We have time for just one more question. Yes, sir, right here.
Hello, Antonio Ortiz from the Embassy of Mexico. I just wanted to get a reaction on the scope and coverage of ACTA in terms of addressing some of the IPR issues that were mentioned, maybe taking an issue-by-issue approach rather than a multi-issue, few partners approach.
Would love to see it, honestly.
Yeah.
Because the problem, the box we're in, of course, is both with respect to our conventional FTAs and with respect to the WTO. We're grappling with the constraint the MFN principle applies to us, and it doesn't allow us space to do very constructive things that would be profoundly liberalizing, as well as we were talking about before, kind of articulating what the underlying legal standards should be globally, if you really want a market economy to help people at the bottom, as well as encourage innovation. So profoundly supportive of trying to do the issue-by-issue approach, but we've got this constraint. And of course, the old trade hack in me thinks that that MFN principle served us pretty damn well for a very long time, so I'd be reluctant to give it up. But we got to find some ways to be creative on issue by issue. And I will say, actually, I'm glad you raised your hand, Antonio, in one sense, because one of the problems I see with TPP and on the issue approach is that unless in North America, given our market, we have thought constructively about how we attack these issues together, we're probably not going to make a lot of progress, to be honest with you. It's not in our interest not to have Mexico and Canada at the table. So in the context of TPP, one of the things in the back of my mind is why aren't we using the leverage of the relationships we have to try and drive change in the most dynamic economy in the world, of which we're all a part. Right, so it just strikes me as odd that Mexico and Canada are also part
Brian,
of
you
the
had a quick
conversation.
answer on that?
I just, I mean, it echoes a lot of what Francis said, both in response to the WTO point and this. I just think this is the world we're in. I think whether it's TPP, whether it's ACTA, we will be looking at best at coalitions of the willing in moving forward with these kinds of initiatives, and that we need to embrace that. We need to strategize about how to do that most effectively. We need to equip ourselves. We need to be willing. We need to be willing. But that's the world we're in, and we better get good at it.
Well, a couple things to close. One, if you want to go home and watch this again, you can do that because the video will be posted a little later today. But the paper is on the website as well as the slides. And lastly, really couldn't have imagined, I couldn't have hoped for three better panelists. Really, just three great experts and really a lot of insight today. So I want to join me in thanking Grant, Brian, and Karan. And Grant, you had the last word.
Will you bleep out my profanity in the
Well, Brian had a profanity.
I think I did too, actually. Yeah.
We do this in live. By the way, this is live webcast, and Brian, our guy, actually has a 3-second tape delay. So we're good to go. So.
Granted, Pascal for you.